So just a little bit about the Water Collaborative. We are a nonprofit here based in New Orleans. We service all of Louisiana and the Southeast, and we represent at all levels of government. So federal level, state level, and local level. We're really focused on urban water management. That kind of makes us unique as a nonprofit in Louisiana, where a lot of water organizations are focused on coastal work. We do urban water management. So things like water quality, affordability and accessibility of water services, flooding and stormwater management, green infrastructure, and community resilience and sustainability. But we're really here to talk about legislation from the 2025 Louisiana session. And so if you go to the next slide, I would love to introduce our wonderful speakers that are here with us today. First, we have Taya Fontenette. Taya serves as our policy and research coordinator. She leads our water quality testing and awareness program and has completed 2 community-based studies focused on PFAS and heavy metals. As manager of our water news blog, her work is grounded in commitment to making science and policy more accessible to the public. Next, we have Kennedy Moore. Kennedy is the state policy coordinator for the Water Collaborative. She assists in various programs, including state revolving fund and insurance advocacy, while also serving as a Lake Pontchartrain watershed ambassador for the EPA's Urban Waters Federal Partnership Program. With these roles, she ensures cross-jurisdictional advocacy and collaborative support can be felt amongst communities at local, state, and regional levels. Also joining us today are Jackson Voss, Charles Nicholson, and Jackson Wright. Jackson Voss is the Government Affairs and Policy Coordinator at the Alliance for Affordable Energy. He focuses on federal and state opportunities to transform Louisiana's policy environment and better protect the state and its people from the worst effects of climate change. Before joining the Alliance, Jackson worked as a policy analyst for Invest in Louisiana, the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center, and in the United States Senate. Originally from New Orleans, he is a proud graduate of Louisiana State University and the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Charles is the Data and Research Program Manager for HousingNOLA. He joined the organization as a fellow before becoming the Data Program Manager, working on HousingNOLA's annual report card on the state of housing in New Orleans. For 2 years, he has staffed and facilitated Housing Louisiana's statewide insurance task force, and as the organization has put a greater focus on tackling the staggering insurance crisis that is damaging Louisiana. Jackson Wright is currently a FEWS Executive Fellow at the City of New Orleans Office of Resilience and Sustainability, where he is supporting the office's efforts around building performance policies and other aspects of the city's climate action plan. Jackson previously was the Director of Special Projects for Governor John Bel Edwards. He was a member of the governor's policy and legislative team and was the infrastructure coordinator for Louisiana, tasked with maximizing funding from the federal bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So our speakers are going to give you their takes on some of the legislation we've been tracking. This includes bills related to the Sewerage and Water Board, to energy, insurance, appropriations, and state governance. And at the end, we're going to hold a Q&A. So as you listen and think of questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can during the Q&A. And with that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Kennedy to get us started.
Perfect. We can go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. And thank you, Rebecca, for the wonderful introduction. So just to preface, we'll be starting off with discussing a few of the Sewage and Water Board bills that were proposed during this session. It's important to note that 5 of the bills that we tracked specifically during this legislative session about Sewage and Water Board, none of them passed. So the 3 that we felt like were the most important to discuss how they could have impacted Louisiana residents includes these 3 bills: House Bill 609, House Bill 611, and Senate Bill 242. So starting off, House Bill 609 would have established a stormwater fee by authorizing Sewage and Water Board to collect funds for stormwater management and drainage infrastructure, specifically in Orleans Parish. And this matters as the bill's language did not clearly define the funding specific uses, Sewage and Water Board's responsibilities, or any of the cuts to or repeals of the drainage millages paid by taxpaying properties. Additionally, the Water Collaborative did propose a similar stormwater fee with a community-focused governance structure through the Water Justice Fund that would have required fees based off of impervious surface area to better implement green infrastructure. Moving on to House Bill 611, if passed, it would have changed the leadership structure and membership of the Sewage and Water Board's Board of Directors by removing the mayor as the president and requiring its members to elect a president to serve 1 year. This change addresses the current reoccurring mention to remove the current conflict of interest by removing the default appointment of the mayor's role of president to allow the Sewage and Water Board's board of directors to gain more independence over board appointments. On the other hand, this bill would have shifted board appointments away from current local representation by removing the requirement that board members must reside in Orleans Parish, along with a mandate that contractors must give employment preferences to local residents. HB 611 would have established better boundaries for Sewage and Water Board's board of directors. However, by shifting from local representation, this may have had the potential of causing distrust of the board for the residents of Orleans Parish. Lastly, Senate Bill 242 would have transferred authority of the Sewage and Water Board from the New Orleans City Council over to the Louisiana Public Service Commission. And while this change had the potential to improve oversight and address longstanding concerns about the Sewage and Water Board, it had similarities to the change mentioned in the previous bill that may have caused distrust from local residents as well. That's all I have for Sewage and Water Board. I'll now hand things over to Taya to discuss some of the bills that we've tracked pertaining to energy and water.
Thank you, Kennedy, and good afternoon, everyone. Let us now go over legislation governing energy and water. In this session, lawmakers examine who gets a seat at the table when Louisiana decides how and where to develop major energy projects, like carbon storage, wind and solar farms, and data centers. These debates intersect with water, as energy projects often rely heavily on local water resources. So some proposals aim to give communities a greater voice, while others focused on centralizing state oversight and attracting major investments. Together, these efforts highlight the state's need to review energy priorities without sidelining public health, local input, or long-term sustainability. So starting with Act 397, just a bit of background. Carbon capture and storage is a process that traps carbon dioxide emissions from industrial sources and injects them deep underground for long-term storage. In 2023, Louisiana gained state regulatory authority over the permitting and enforcement of these underground injection wells. Though seen as a climate solution, carbon capture carries risks, as equipment failures can lead to CO2 leaks that affect nearby air and water quality. So Act 397 strengthens incident reporting, mandating that operators report incidents to local authorities within 24 hours. The law also broadens the type of violations that may result in daily fines of up to $200,000. In contrast, House Bill 696, which failed to pass, took a more preventative approach by calling for stricter emergency planning, increased training, and groundwater monitoring. So while Act 397 improves transparency after incidents happen, the failure of House Bill 696 leaves a critical gap in proactive safeguards, raising concerns about whether Louisiana's oversight is sufficient as this process continues to expand across the state. So next, with Act 458, this act reorganizes the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, replacing it with the newly created Department of Conservation and Energy, effective October 1st, 2025. So this major restructuring is part of Governor Landry's DRIVE initiative to shrink state government and consolidate functions for faster decision-making and cost savings. So now the oversight of oil, gas, minerals, water, and permitting is centralized under a single department secretary, consolidating responsibilities previously divided across multiple LDE&R offices. So among the many provisions, the lengthy act calls for a statewide water resource program to support long-term water security and promote coordinated management across parishes and sectors, which has the potential to address some long-standing gaps in Louisiana's water management. The law also changes how permits are handled, allowing for faster approval processes. Supporters say that this will accelerate project development, especially for energy projects, while critics warn it may weaken environmental reviews and limit public input. But overall, the restructuring gives the governor and the department secretary greater control over environmental enforcement and project approvals, raising concerns about whether the department will be able to balance natural resource protection with industrial growth. And lastly, Act 462 expands Louisiana's definition of green energy to include fossil fuels as long as the emissions meet federal air quality standards. So the law directs state agencies to prioritize energy sources that are affordable, dispatchable, and domestically produced, using definitions that heavily favor fossil fuels. For example, affordable is based on the lowest cost method, and dispatchable is defined by a source's ability to respond to grid demands at any time. And so both of these criteria disadvantage renewable resources like wind and solar in a state that has a lot of gas infrastructure already set in place. So these new definitions apply to all state-funded green or energy or clean energy programs, meaning fossil fuel-based electricity could now qualify for public funding intended to support low-emission energy projects. This shift blurs the distinction between clean and carbon-intensive sources, potentially undermining the long-term transition to energy security in the state. So now I will pass it to Jackson Voss to add any details related to water and energy that he might like to highlight.
Absolutely, thank you. So just to build on what Taya was saying, I think there are a few of these things, a few of these bills in particular, that would have moved local authority to things like the Public Service Commission from the Sewage and Water Board, right? So we have some of these bills that were aiming on, and I think intended to try to address some of the problems that we see with Sewage and Water Board, and those of us who live in New Orleans experience often issues with that institution. But as somebody who works at the Alliance for Affordable Energy, which is a consumer and environmental advocacy organization focused on advocating at institutions like the Public Service Commission, I think we can tell everybody that it's not always so easy to make sure that things run there easily as well. So I think in particular with initiatives like stormwater drainage fees, other things, you'd be talking about taking approval away from things like the city council, which are directly elected by the people of New Orleans, and then giving it to a body where only 2 members of the 5-member commission actually represent any parts of New Orleans. And both of those members actually represent a lot more than New Orleans, right? All that to say, taking local control, giving it to a larger state body that may not necessarily understand the issues at play and may not necessarily have the same priorities as might exist at the local level. So I think that was one of the concerns that did come up and that we discussed with the Water Collaborative at the Alliance during the session. Moving on to these other bills about energy, and I think just for people's reference, I think Act 458, many people probably may not recognize that one right away, except maybe when you mention that it's a 225-page reorganization of the state energy department, right, to become the Department of Conservation Energy. A lot of those changes were just literally changing the name of the agency. So there's parts of that that are not too problematic, although it is a little confusing to change the name of an agency 3 times in 3 years. But there are things in that bill also that will change the way that that agency will work. In some ways, I think it will probably help to advance all kinds of energy projects, including potentially renewable projects, if it were not for the bill that I want to talk about next, which is Act 462. And so I think 458, there are a number of things engaged in that have to do with larger issues of environmental justice that are still concerning, that people still will need to watch closely to see what those departments do at the state level. 462 is a bill that was very concerning, not just to us at the Alliance, but also a lot of environmental justice groups and also a lot of business organizations across the state, in part because it does seem to be aimed at undermining the ability of renewable industry to be developed in Louisiana. There were some changes made to this bill during the process that did make it at least give some throw a bone a little bit to renewables as far as it's concerned for large industry. But I think this bill is still problematic in that it is trying to guide the state in a very particular direction. For those who may not know, about 75% of the electricity produced in Louisiana is produced using natural gas right now. And so the idea that the problem with our electricity system, the reason that we have power outages, the reason that we don't have affordable bills is because we don't use enough natural gas, that can't be true. We use almost entirely natural gas in many cases. Most people are not receiving very much renewable energy or other forms of energy. And so in our perspective, and actually the perspective of a lot of people in business and industry, and actually I think in the perspective of a lot of people in state government, it would be better to have a more diverse set of energy sources. And Act 462 might make that more difficult to do because it may have utilities in particular say, the state wants us to invest in oil and gas. and they're going to call it green energy. And so we're going to invest in green energy in the form of oil and gas. And so a number of issues that'll arise from that, and we'll have to see how it all turns out depending on how it's implemented.
Thank you, Jackson. Kennedy, handing it back over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, again, thank you, Jackson. That was a fantastic explanation of how these bills and laws may affect or may have affected folks living in Louisiana. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to move into some of the bills that deal with homeowners and flood insurance now. And just to preface, it's important to note that this year's theme of bills proposed and laws that have been passed does support homeowners across the state in terms of excessive insurance rates and policy premiums. This change in pace seems to stem from last year's support opposite for insurance companies to better improve competitive markets. So to start off with, Act 79. Senate Bill 235 and House Resolution 291 are the ones that I'll be discussing, and they pushed for excessive homeowner and flood insurance rates to be addressed in a multitude of ways. So regarding Act 79, it credits a portion of the current 4.85% tax of the premium of a homeowner's insurance policy towards the Louisiana Fortify Homes Program Fund. This funding source provides grants to homeowners to strengthen their roofs and protect their homes in preparation against storms, flooding, and other adverse weather events. Along with this redirected stream of funding to the program, this law dedicates $15 of each claim adjuster and public adjuster's licensing and registration fees towards the Louisiana Fortify Homes Program. So in all, Act 79 will ultimately increase the number of homeowners that the program can assist each year, while also encouraging easier access to roof and home fortification. Up next, Senate Bill 235, which, if passed, would have established an individual state income tax credit of no more than $2,000 for payments made on primary residence homeowners insurance policy premiums. This bill aimed to grant a combined total of $10 million every calendar year for a total of 10 years to homeowners on a first-come, first-served basis. And it also would have mandated that eligible homeowners may not have an annual income that exceeds 200% of the federal poverty line. This is important because this specification prioritizes lower and middle income homeowners. And lastly, Senate Bill 235 aimed to protect homeowners against unaffordable insurance premiums while also providing an incentive for homeowners without insurance to receive financial restitution for then insuring their homes. Last up, House Resolution 291 urges the United States Congress to end the Federal Emergency Management Agency's, or FEMA's, Risk Rating 2.0 flood insurance model. This resolution addresses FEMA's attempts to address disaster protection by utilizing this tool to set premiums based on property-specific factors, and that includes the distance to water, the home's elevation, and the home's exposure risk. However, with the increased severity and occurrence of storms, including disasters, coastal and lower income communities in Louisiana suffered through spikes of premium insurance rates based on the tool's data. This resolution recommendations include passing acts that provide better transparency for homeowners on how their rates are calculated by this tool, and also relieves excessive rates for homeowners by establishing refundable tax credits for low and middle income National Flood Insurance Program policyholders. It's really important to note that this resolution, and all resolutions in general, cannot compel Congress, or in this case, FEMA, to act. It only urges these federal officials to help the state's residents with increasing costs. Unfortunately, as FEMA and other federal agencies face budget cuts, Congress may be resistant to increasing credits and public transparency due to the resources that it is necessary to do so. So that's all I have on these three bills and law. I'll go ahead and pass it on to our guest speaker on insurance, Charles Nicholson, to share his thoughts and any other bills that he may be interested in discussing.
Thank you so much, Kennedy, for that. So speaking from the perspective of HousingNOLA, I'm sure people on this webinar know, Louisiana has the highest rate of insurance in the Gulf. And depending on certain calculations, if you're taking into account things like cost of living, arguably one of the highest in the country overall. So as our organization is tracking increases in construction and mortgage and rent costs, those costs are also being exacerbated by the rising insurance costs, which is only making home ownership even further out of reach. Um, so from us, there was no real meaningful insurance reform with direct impact passed on this legislative session, and I'll kind of get into that. I know there is something to be said about Act 79 that is helpful, but there was also some uh, problems with that as well. But uh, before the session started, a report was released by the Louisiana Legislative Auditor ahead of session. They predicted that we would see a tide shift where premiums will start to go down once 25% of houses across the state have a fortified roof or an equal level of resilience. So at the current rate at which roofs are being installed, the Louisiana Fortified Homes Program, um, which is about 364 roofs a month, we won't reach that percentage until the year 2062. Um, and were we to increase that to 7,500 a month, we could get there by 2030. So that's why, in large part, a lot of the bills that were filed this session were directed towards the Louisiana Fortified Homes Program. So Act 79 acts as a funding mechanism for the program. Um, and what it does is it taxes insurance premiums for surplus lines, and surplus lines insurance is an alternative type of insurance coverage for those who can't get coverage in the standard market, usually due to things like high risk or really old homes. Um, so with this act, every year, the first 5 million collected in taxes will be credited to the Fortify program. And we have been pushing for more funding for the program as well. We would have liked to have seen the burden of funding this not be put on policyholders through the form of taxes. Um, and we were also hoping to see an additional $10 million in funding for the program before this bill had initially been filed, but unfortunately that didn't end up happening. Going into SB 235, this was one of the ones that we were championing the hardest. This bill would have provided $2,000 in tax credits or cash rebate for those who make less than $25,000 a year, according to federal poverty guidelines. So what ended up happening, this was an interesting one because it lost by 2 votes on the final vote, but that happened immediately after it was watered down by a poison pill amendment that was passed that reduced the funding from 10 million to $1 million. Uh, and the commentary by certain legislators on the floor uh, was uh, very weird and concerning just because they were they had received a lot of calls and emails from their constituents due to a flood of people in support of this bill, and they used that as an excuse for why they didn't want to support 235, even though we know that that's definitely not the reason why they were not uh, voting for the bill. Um, so this bill was meant to be more of a band-aid to help homeowners deal with the costs while we waited for other permanent solutions, like the Fortify program, to start bringing premiums down. Um, so it was a great disappointment to us to see this not come through. And then House Resolution 291. This one I wasn't sure about ahead of time, but so I looked into it. This resolution deals in flood insurance, which we only sometimes discuss in our insurance calls, but it is a call to the U.S. Congress to pass a package of flood insurance, uh, sorry, package of flood insurance legislation that would alleviate flood insurance costs. Most notably, they were calling for the end of the National Flood Insurance Program's Risk Rating 2.0 rating system. And Risk Rating 2.0 has been widely criticized by insurance consumers and experts nationally due to its lack of transparency in data inputs and not delivering on premium reductions, even in cases where homeowners are paying for mitigation upgrades like raising their homes. And there are some filed legislations in Congress that would require FEMA to publish all of its data methods used in Risk Rating 2.0 and cap annual flood insurance increases at 9% and is currently at 18% among some other bills as well. So for this one, this is a good bill just for messaging. Like Kennedy said, it's only designed to implore the federal legislature to move on addressing flood insurance, but it doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms. So it kind of and it also flies in the face of the fact that uh, our state legislature also voted down other insurance bills that would have helped. Um, and there is one more bill that we were championing as well. That was SB 222, which was also by Senator DePlus's. It would have mandated a 20% minimum discount on insurance premiums for fortified roofs. This is legislation that we championed 2 years in a row because it was filed in the previous year's legislative session as well. Fortified roofs are already a heavy investment, average cost of them being about $15,000 per roof. So we feel that this kind of investment should demand significantly lower premiums. The insurance commissioner, Tim Temple, has fought every step of the way against this legislation, stating that it's anti-business and anti-free market and urging homeowners to shop around instead. So uh, again, it was overall, from an insurance perspective, not the most positive outcome for us, but that's all I have for insurance.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your insight on all three bills and then providing some insight on what bills could have passed that would have mitigated some of these issues. And I am super excited to hear later on your in-depth take on how this year's session went overall regarding insurance. We can go on to the next slide, please. All right, I'm going to touch on some of the laws pertaining to appropriation, specifically for funding for water management. And I'm going to start off just by kind of giving an overview of Acts 1 and 2. So House Bills 1 and 2, which of course are now Acts 1 and 2, are the first bills proposed to provide budgeting for the state during every legislative session. To summarize, Act 1 provides appropriations for the ordinary operating expenses of the state government for the fiscal years 2025 to 2026, while Act 2 provides for the comprehensive capital outlay budget for fiscal year 2025 to 2026. So to kind of summarize down a little bit, Act 1 lays out what funds are allocated for programs throughout the state, including those related to state agencies, local government, university programs, etc. On the other hand, Act 2 lays out what funds are allocated for construction projects throughout the state by detailing how much money is dedicated through bonds and trust funds. So a key change made by Act 1 includes the allocation of $5 million towards the Division of Administration's Emergency Subfund of its Water Sector Fund. On Act 2's side, $6 million were allocated towards the City of New Orleans Lincoln Beach redevelopment planning and construction, while the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, or CPRA, is set to receive nearly $1 billion towards coastal protection projects, planning, and construction. Lastly, I'll quickly touch on Act 461, which makes supplemental appropriations for state fiscal year 2024 to 2025. This law provides appropriations for a multitude of projects and programs, designated nearly $500 million in total and targeted one-time funds across multiple sectors. And with these $1 million allocated to hundreds of local government entities and state agencies, this law aims to support community projects and local needs. Notably, Act 461 allocates over $25 million total in multiple disaster relief efforts, including storms, flooding, and hurricanes, including storms dating back to 2008. Over $19 million alone has been designated for non-congregate sheltering efforts and outstanding state management costs for hurricanes Gustav, Laura, Ida, and Francine. Overall, this funding allows those affected by past disasters to improve mass care efforts, sheltering efforts, and supporting those for future disasters as well. So I'm going to pass it back on to my colleague Taya to discuss some of the state governance and water management bills that were passed.
Yes, thank you again. So in response to mounting challenges, lawmakers advanced a series of bills aimed at reshaping how the state governs water and asserts its sovereignty. So the creation of new task force and statewide authority boards signals a move towards more regional coordination, especially in response to threats like saltwater intrusion and water system failures. At the same time, the state attempted to revise procedures for appointing local drainage commissioners and debated the role of fluoride in our drinking water. But as climate pressures mount and infrastructure ages, the choices made now will shape the sustainability of Louisiana's water systems for years to come. So first, with Act 395. After Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana legislature created the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority to ensure that the levee oversight in the greater New Orleans area will be guided by qualified experts and local residents. The authority was split into East and West divisions, each managing the separate levee systems on each side of the Mississippi River. So Act 395 marks the most significant overhaul of the structure of the boards since 2006. So it reshapes the East Board by introducing 3 non-resident members for the first time, reducing the number of science and engineering professionals, and extending term limits for board members. So while the stated goal is to broaden representation and to keep, good supporters on the board, these changes move away from the original expert-led model that was designed to safeguard our region's critical flood infrastructure. Recent instability, including board member resignations and multiple changes to the board president, has raised questions about the impacts of these reforms, especially during hurricane season. Next, with Act 418, this creates the Current Authority Board, which stands for the Coordinated Use of Resources for Recreation, Economy, Navigation, and Transportation. This new 16-member board, housed under the Department of Transportation and Development, is responsible for leading the planning and coordination for non-coastal infrastructure and economic projects. And it includes representatives from levee boards, ports, industry, and development groups. Modeled in part after the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, CPRA, Current is tasked with developing an upland master plan and annual plans to guide regional efforts in water management, infrastructure, and resilience. So this marks an important step towards closing long-standing investment gaps in areas beyond the state's coastal zone. But for Current to succeed, it will need to prioritize community input and subject matter expertise to ensure that its work delivers long-term value. Next, with House Resolution 305, this creates a 12-member task force to study the feasibility of a regional water purification system for St. Charles, Jefferson, Orleans, St. Bernard, and Plaquemines parishes. All 5 parishes rely on the Mississippi River as their primary source of drinking water, making everyone especially vulnerable to recurring saltwater intrusion events, as we have seen over the past 2 years. So the task force is charged with evaluating potential costs, governance models, and funding sources for a consolidated system. Members will be appointed by a mix of state and local officials, with at least 1 representative from each parish, and findings and recommendations are due to all local authorities and state authorities by March 15, 2026. So while a regional facility could improve efficiency and water quality, dependence on a centralized system could increase risk if disruptions occur. But as the task force moves forward, it will need to carefully consider regional planning goals and the impacts of potentially that could occur in the host community of St. Charles Parish. Next slide, please. So, Act 105 helps to redefine waters of the state. For a bit of background, in 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court's Sackett versus Environmental Protection Agency decision significantly narrowed the scope of the Clean Water Act, ruling that it only applies for protections to wetlands with continuous surface connection to federally protected waters. So this change excludes many isolated wetlands and smaller streams that are connected only by groundwater or flow for only part of the year. In response, Act 105 narrows Louisiana's definition of waters of the state, to match the federal ruling. Senator Fessy, who led this charge, led a similar effort last year through a concurrent resolution that failed to advance where Act 105 succeeded. And given that Louisiana contains nearly 40% of the nation's remaining wetlands, this change could weaken protections for areas of the state that are already vulnerable. In a related effort with Act 87, that creates the Louisiana Conservation Incentive Program, which offers support to private landowners who own about 80% of the state's wetlands to voluntarily restore the land on their property. However, its impact will depend on landowner participation and future budget commitments. Together, these laws reflect a broader move towards voluntary private conservation as we see traditional regulatory safeguards being scaled back. And lastly, is with Act 237. So 237 gives the Louisiana Attorney General expanded authority to intervene in federal legal matters and limit the ability of local entities to enter into consent decrees without state level approval. So consent decrees are court-approved agreements used to settle disputes over compliance, usually without admitting wrongdoing. But under the new law, local authorities must notify both the Attorney General and the governor within 30 days of any proposed federal oversight and obtain approval to comply with any long-term obligations. So this includes all current and future agreements, which could range from policing reforms to environmental compliance. This centralization of power is framed as a defense of state sovereignty, but it could restrict local flexibility and delay much needed reforms. So now I will pass it to Jackson Wright to add his perspective on this session's updates to state governance.
Thanks, Taya, and thanks, Kennedy. And I would just start by saying that it's been a couple years since I was tracking sessions very closely. So my comments are going to be kind of impressions. I was trying to review some of the bills I would be covering before we met, but I'll start with what you just said about Act 237 and that notice requirement for entering into consent decree. That's a really bad bill, and I'm glad y'all brought it up. And I just, it's just really part of a trend that the current governor and the attorney general of being anti, civil rights, anti-environmental justice, and questioning, why would we need it? Anyway, so it has not that much to do with the current federal administration, but a lot to do with, if we have a Democrat or someone who cares about pretty important issues that wants to use something like a consent decree to make significant changes where the state or that local government has been unable to step up. I just think that that's something we should, that's bad, and I'm glad you all brought it up. Same thing with Senator Fessy. Basically, and I apologize if this offends anyone, but any bill that he's carrying is generally a bad bill. So, but just coming back to the appropriations, if you could go back to those two slides, I just wanted to add a little bit on that. Worked on the budget as part of the That's good. Yeah. So just, really good points that were made here. I would encourage, they're both in Act 1, which is like the operating budget, has a little bit of, you'll see a lot of it is just sort of the allocating funds, appropriating funds to state agencies, but there are some kind of line item projects that are identified in Act 1 across the state. You'll see more of that in Act 2 and Act 461, the capital outlay bill, and what they call the supplemental bill. The Act 2, if you or even 461, you can go online and look at the PDF, and it's a huge, really long document, but you can Control F and search the PDF for drainage or water or sewer if you're curious to see where some of those projects are across the state. I know Julie O'Donoghue does a good job, the reporter of, and I don't know if she's done it in the last session or for this session yet, but she usually combs through those bills and tries to map where, all those funds are flowing, because those two are kind of like, especially the supplemental bill, or where you see these the legislators um, identifying their list of projects that are funded across the state, that are one-time funds, that are small amounts, but there's a lot of behind the scenes negotiations that are happening to ensure that certain projects are in there and other projects are not. And so, it's an important thing to see. Number one is your community might be listed in there, or it might not be listed in there, and there are reasons for that. And I just think both of those would be important to look at. And then one more thing I'll say about Act Two: it's a little confusing to read, but if you are looking at it, the items that are called Priority One, P1, Priority One, those are going to be, when you see funding for that, those are going to be the projects that are going to go first to the bond commission. And so those are going to be the kind of the ones that are most likely to kind of get a green light to move forward if it has P1 or Priority One funding or State General Fund funding in Act Two. So yeah, I would encourage folks, if you haven't, take a look at those. Control F, or whatever term you like, but if we're talking about water or drainage, there's I think in the supplemental bill, when I did that, and when I just searched drainage, there were at least 50 or 60 throughout the state that are small. Some of them are small, some of them are larger sources of appropriations, but they spend a lot of money, and it's not very transparent, and a lot of it changes right at the last minute. And I think it's just really important. And I'm glad y'all brought it up. And then otherwise, like I said, I wasn't following things very closely. I'll just say one thing about the current bill. I think that's Senator Presley. If you go to the next slide. So I think, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting concept, and I think it's important that we bring it up in this call, and something to monitor over time, and make sure that you're aware of what the implications of this is for the whole state. So I think that's actually a pretty large bill, and I'm sure it took a lot of effort, and it wasn't just in this one year that folks have been working on that. I bring it up because another thing that I think is helpful to note for all of these bills, who the author is and what the votes were, is often a good starting point if you're curious about a bill and what people's positions were. And so, I think there's I would just say that that's something I would encourage folks to do, which you can do on the legislative website as well, to see if anyone voted no, or if all the Dems voted no, or everyone in New Orleans voted no, or wherever you're located, just because I think it can kind of give you a sense. Sometimes it's very hard to read the bills and know exactly what they do on first glance, but yeah, so those are my comments. And I'll leave it at that for now, and happy to continue discussion and take questions as I can be helpful. But thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Jackson. And thank you to all of our speakers, really, for taking this on and being here and giving us different sort of perspectives on all this, right? We come from the perspective of water and urban water infrastructure and management. Jackson comes from this from utility and energy sector. Charles comes from this from the insurance and housing sector. Jackson Wright comes at this from more of that like state level funding and management. So it's wonderful to have everybody's perspectives on this and takes. I will remind folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm seeing a couple come in already. We do have time for that. I'm going to hand it over really to each of our guest speakers for a few minutes to give their takes on the session as a whole, or add anything to what we've already discussed, comment on something that somebody else has discussed. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So again, put your questions in the chat. Once we get to Q&A, you're also welcome to raise your hand and we'll get to your question. We're going to go in order of when they're received, and we'll try to get to everything as we can. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jackson Voss to start, and just, how was the session for you? You track the legislation, state legislation. You've done this for years. So what have you seen that's different this year from previous years?
Yeah, good question. So I think that there's a number of things that we've learned as things have gone on, especially with this new administration and a new state legislature, right? So we have some pretty significant turnover in the legislature after the last election in 2023. We have totally new leadership in place. I think that and I think that while I agree with Jackson's assessment of the administration and some of the measures that have been pushed to sort of consolidate power and move things around, there certainly has been, and I think it's fair to say, some real efforts at what we would, I think, most generously describe as power grabs, right? By the governor's office, by the attorney general's office, by these other major executive powers, and the legislature has been willing to give some of that over. However, I think there's also been over the last couple of years a lot of fissures that have been revealed, right? I think there are a lot less consensus amongst some of these elected officials than people would have expected with a Republican supermajority in each chamber of the legislature, plus a Republican governor and Republican statewide officers. That's not to say that the differences in opinion are insurmountable. And I think they do often find a way to meet in the middle, which is not necessarily where we would like them to be, right? In the middle between themselves, not necessarily in the middle between where we are and where they are. But I do think that that's something that's important for us to know, especially as advocates for those of us who do policy work at the legislature, to understand that there are actual disagreements still at play here. There are still pressure points at which we can, as people who have oftentimes a very different perspective on where our state needs to go and how our state government needs to work. There are still opportunities to do this work in a way that's going to either rein in some of those efforts to consolidate power and to do things that, from our point of view, are deeply harmful, but also opportunities to potentially derail some of the things that are harmful. So all that to say, a lot of challenges at the state legislature. It's a very challenging place to be, and I think many people agreed that this past session was a really trying one. I heard many people describe it as the worst one that they've been through, and I wouldn't dispute that. But I do think that there is still a lot of work to be done there, and I think that I hope would encourage people, if you're interested in working at the state legislature and getting more involved there, that you do so, and that you engage with those of us who do work there to figure out how.
Thank you, Jackson. Charles?
Thank you. Yeah, uh, Jackson is much deeper into the legislature than I am, so I'll keep mine a little brief. What I'll say is that I mean, mostly just echoing what Jackson is saying. It's it's rough out there when it comes to state politics. Um, so like for us, uh, when we went into this session, Housing Louisiana, we put together a campaign with like local, state, and even some national partners, and some of them even on this call to strategize and push insurance reform at the state level. And we even organized like a lot of residents statewide to get involved politically. And the outcome of it did lead to certain representatives uh, kind of flipping their votes, changing their stances a little bit. So pressure does work. Like Brett Jackson said, there are pressure points that can be applied, and we are seeing that. And uh, I think what we are also seeing too, if just speaking on SB 222, the bill that would have required a mandatory discount for insurance premiums, the version of that bill that was submitted last year, I think we saw a little bit more of willingness from certain legislators to back a bill like this. I think there is a powerful insurance lobby in this state that is trying to make sure that a bill like that does not pass. And I think that there is coming to a sort of realization for a lot of legislators that at some point you have to do something. Like there has to be a real solution that will bring insurance premiums down. Otherwise, we're not going to have a state anymore. There won't be people in the state of Louisiana anymore because no one can afford their insurance premiums, which means they can't afford to either keep their home uh, be- because they can't afford the insurance premiums in the first place. So, um, like Jackson said, yeah, it was a fairly disappointing session from both a housing and an insurance standpoint.
Thank you, Charles. Jackson, right?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jackson and Charles, for that. And again, so I was not deeply involved. I had one little issue I was like talking to somebody about during the session, but I wasn't tracking everything every day like I did for 4 years. And I'll just say that I think it's really good that this webinar is happening. And there should be more of this, because what I've realized being away from it for a couple of years, when you guys asked me to be on and I was looking through the bills, you know, you read the even if you read the news every day, you really have no idea how much is happening, how many bills, number one, are being passed, and sometimes passed with no real debate, unanimous votes. Um, and you don't know why, and you don't know what the purpose is as someone from the outside. And to be honest, even if you're watching every single second of committee and the floor, sometimes you don't know why someone's bringing a bill or why it's moving. And I just think it's a shame that that we're not well, how do I put this? We need to be holding the legislature to higher standards on this, and one way to do that is to to pay attention and go to events like this and try to synthesize it, try to understand what's out there, and ask questions and try to understand, why the things are happening that are happening. But I think you got to know what's happening first. So I just think it's an important thing that we're having this webinar. And I would also say I can't imagine how hard it is now. It was hard enough, when you had a Democratic governor with a Republican legislature, and for folks who are more progressive, let's say, maybe not that hard for some people. Um, but I'll just say that yeah, I mean, it's hard work, and it's a multi-year effort for a lot of this stuff, um, you know, and I'm glad too that y'all talked about bills that didn't pass, because that doesn't mean they won't pass in a year or 2 years or 3 years from now, as issues continue to be ironed out, as coalitions are built. And so I think I would definitely encourage folks who are interested to get involved and to but don't talk to me, so because I'm not doing that anymore. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, no, I think that's all I would really say, and just appreciate this session.
Thank you, Jackson. Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point that it takes years. And I don't think a lot of people who aren't in this space know that when you're working on policy, it doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't even happen within one session. A lot of this stuff, it takes years to build on and build on and build on. It fails a majority of the time, and it's refined and changed and amended. And then eventually, potentially, there's movement and something gets passed. So, as all of you alluded to, it's so important for the public in any way that we can, right? And that's really hard. That's really hard, even for us who do this work, right? Like it's hard to track everything, to understand everything all of the time. But as much as we can, as residents of Louisiana who care about Louisiana, who care about the environment, who care about these issues, to get involved however we can. So I'm grateful to you guys, and I'm grateful to everyone who's on this call as well, who wants to learn more about these issues. We do have one question that I saw in the chat that has sort of been answered that we'll come back to in a second, but I just wanted to also ask the question. And again, guys, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand. But one thing, that again, you guys alluded to was like this idea of getting people involved. And so how can the everyday person, regular folks, sort of get involved in advocacy at the state level? Like what's one or two things that people could do realistically, tangibly, to sort of try to move the needle a little bit?
I can hop in here real quick. I think that there's, first of all, a number of things you can do. If you don't work for, some of us, our jobs are doing advocacy, which is great. I enjoy it a lot. Not everybody gets that privilege. For those of you who may not be able to do that, who may not have that opportunity, I would strongly recommend joining some like sort of civic good organizations, or getting on listservs, joining newsletters, things like that, where people are talking about these issues. Like many of these bills, They may not get talked about in the press, but I promise you that there's some organization in the state that has included it in its letter that's saying this is something that you should care about that's happening in the state legislature, whether you're talking about PAR or the Alliance for Affordable Energy or Invest in Louisiana or Housing New Orleans. Like all of us do these things. We try to keep people updated. We probably could do a better job of it. And I think we're trying to learn how to. But I think that the truth is that there is a lot of work going on and a lot of people doing this work. And I think that I would strongly encourage that you just fill up your email inbox with everything that you could be interested in. And it's a good way to keep up with things. That being said, I would also say keep an eye out. I'm going to be trying to find a way to make this stuff more publicly accessible going to next session, me personally. And I've been working with people like Charles and Jackson and others and Rebecca and all these like other organizations to try to make sure that people are getting that information. So keep an eye out for that sometime in the next year.
I'll also add to, um, I think for people who want to get involved, I think a good place to start would be to find an issue that matters to you, um, whether that be housing, whether it be clean water, clean environments, no matter what it is, like and then following through on that, finding sources that discuss those issues. Like Jackson said, so many organizations out there that are tackling specific issues that matter to everyday people. And those organizations and those outlets, they can tell you how you can get involved. They will tell you exactly in what ways you can get involved at the local level, at the state level. Um, so, and I think I'll also say too, maybe even diversify your news sources. Like maybe sometimes you're following a news source that's, you know, if you're a reader of uh, a mainstream local paper, the NOLA.com, whatever, you know, check to see what maybe Louisiana Illuminator is talking about. Maybe there's an article there that's there that you aren't hearing on like WWL or NOLA.com. So yeah, so those are a couple of things that you could do to help you start to get more politically involved.
I would echo what folks have said. I would maybe just mention one thing that I need to do a better job of is actually calling a legislator's office. If you have an issue in mind, I feel like sometimes some of the bills that get filed, not necessarily passed, or because like a legislator had a bunch of people on Facebook make comments about something and then they decide to file a bill. And so like it's actually surprising. A single voice can have a pretty good impact. I don't know that they get a whole lot of calls, honest. I mean, they do, but it's not like a member of Congress or something. They represent a much smaller number of people. So I think it's if you don't know who your state rep or state senator are, you're in a certain, you can find out from the Go Vote app or online to find out, who represents you, and they all have staff. So not that many staff, but they do have staff. So that's something I would recommend. Also, if you really want to get in the weeds, I know social media, and it's been a while since I've been following it, but there are like hashtags that people use that are pretty active. Can't recommend them for your mental health necessarily, but if you really want to know kind of like what's happening in the moment, there's hashtags like at LaGov and LaLedge and everything. So anyway, that's another way to. Social media is actually, there are some good accounts too. I'm sure that'll be good to follow just during the session that really kind of do a good job of recapping what's going on.
Yeah, thank you guys. And I think you make some really, really good points. Charles, even to your point that you just made, like diversify your news sources, right, is something important too. Like I think we get stuck looking at resources that sort of like provide confirmation bias, right? Like things that we agree with constantly. So if you're a more progressive person, look at Fox News, watch Fox News for a little bit, see what they're saying. If you're more conservative, watch MSNBC, for example, see what they're saying. And really it gives you, it allows you to sort of like bolster and build your arguments a little bit better, right? To know what the other side is sort of talking about and how to sort of combat that if you don't agree with it and that kind of thing. So thank you all. I know we had one, and I'll just flag that Taya put in the chat, Louisiana state legislators, if you want to find that. Jackson, to your point, you're right. Like they get calls, but they don't get a lot of calls. And I think that people don't really recognize that necessarily, that it can actually make a difference to hear from you because they work for us, right? They're supposed to work for us. That's the point of them. They are public servants. And so really, I think a lot of people feel defeated or like, oh, it's not going to matter, but it could. It actually really could because maybe they're not hearing it all from this issue. I know, having worked in this space, even talking to different state representatives that are more conservative, Republican, and they're like, I don't know anything about water, honestly, right? Because these guys, they're not experts in any one particular subject necessarily, or any of the things that we're necessarily talking about. So it's up to us to sort of educate them the best that we can. And so get in there, right? Talk to them and say, hey, here's what's going on. Let me tell you, introduce yourself. I've always found that it's really, you can have a lot of success by not coming at folks immediately, right? Imagine somebody meeting you and saying, hi, nice to meet you. Let me tell you everything you're doing wrong. Right? It's not a good strategy in life. And so setting up an introductory call with folks and saying, here's who I am. How can we work together? What are you interested in? And then again, that education piece and saying, well, here's what's going on in my community, the things that we're seeing, and trying to work with folks. And I think that's just really important, especially in a state like Louisiana, right? Where it is more conservative. And here we are talking about water and environmental issues, which unfortunately tend to be, more progressive, even though I think it should be bipartisan or nonpartisan to talk about this stuff. And so it's really important to just reach across the aisle as much as we can, because you might be surprised and find that there are folks out there who you think would be against what you're talking about who really aren't. They just don't know how to navigate that necessarily. So I will go back to Erica's question because we did have one in the chat and I know it's sort of been answered. And again, feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. It doesn't have to be about what we talked about specifically. Like if you have a question about anything from this session, please feel free to raise your hand. But Erica, you had mentioned, you asked if the AG's approval of a consent decree is mandatory or discretionary. I know there was a little bit of back and forth. Erica, if you want to come off mute and clarify your question a little bit or say anything extra. And if not, I'm going to open it up to our guest speakers to sort of fill in that answer a little bit more for people.
Sure. My question was basically, does the AG have to automatically review every single consent decree, or are there some that might get through, and if they're not on the governor or the AG's priority list, they're just going to go into effect? And or public pressure could say this is really important to our community. We want this consent decree, and maybe that would keep them from reviewing or suing. And as Jackson answered, the governor has the discretion to, ask the AG to review it and take action or not. So it is possible that if we know something is coming down the pike and it's particularly important to a community, that you could put pressure on to keep something in place, or contrastly, make sure they take action again in response to it.
And I would just add that one of the interesting things that it does too is it require if you're potentially going to be subject to a consent decree, you're now going to have to be required to notify the Attorney General, and you'll be required to seek a 60-day stay to give the Attorney General time to review. So definitely, the judge doesn't have to grant that request, but it seems like their intent is to be like reviewing every single one that comes through. But I think that Erica bring up a good point, is it also gives you time to advocate for it if that is what makes sense.
Yes, and I also wanted to add that we will have to see how either this federal administration or the next or any future ones respond to this being put into action, and see how that goes, and if this will hold up in the ways that they expect it to. Yes, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm going to do that really awkward pause for like 10, 20 seconds. No questions? We all feel like we did a good job, guys, I guess. I think we answered everything thoroughly. I hope that everybody is feeling like an expert now in some ways on this or coming out of this more informed. Um, I really thank you guys for coming into this. We just dropped our full report in the chat. That is now live for folks to look at. Again, this report is like 73 pages. We didn't have time to talk about everything that was in the report itself. We decided to highlight a couple of things. And so if you read the report, you have any questions, our emails are listed here. You're welcome to talk with us. This is our second year of doing this, which is, we're going to keep doing it every year, hopefully, and make this more of a regular thing. So super excited to see what is going on next session. I want to add, because there's so much doom and gloom, right, when we're talking about state legislation. And so I want to hear from our guest speakers, if there aren't any more questions, just one positive about the session, if you can find it, that we can end on that note. I love this. We have to go deep into our brains. Is there something positive about the session?
I'll take a stab. I think I think to the point I made earlier, I think that we are starting to see, I think especially for those of us who have serious policy disagreements with the administration that's in charge right now, we are starting to see the legislature begin to push back a bit more. And I think that there is going to be opportunity because of that to try to protect some of the things that we have accomplished over the last few years, to try to prevent those things from being rolled back. And also potentially opportunities, I think to a point that Charles made earlier, to actually force these policymakers to think about what will actually solve people's problems, because we can't just keep uh, ignoring them, which I think we're not even nibbling around the edges of a lot of these problems, right? We are fully ignoring them. We're trying to avoid them. And I think that when we reach a point where it's no longer about just partisan victories and it becomes an issue of like, well, if we do this, it'll actually hurt people. I think that creates opportunities for us to say, here's how we can actually help people. And I think that is something that we need to be building on after this session and going forward.
Yeah, there's opportunity. Jackson, Wright, or Charles? There's no pressure.
I would just say, I mean, again, I wasn't following the session that closely, but I know that there were probably hundreds of bills that were really bad that were killed in part from the work of folks like y'all. So that's always a highlight when you see a bad bill die.
Yeah.
I guess maybe not specific to the session, but a quote that I like to think of every now and then is, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So
Yeah. Thank you for that, Charles. Yeah, I think, and I just want to call out Power Coalition, expanded voting rights that boost transparency for voters. So very exciting. Congratulations. And then Nellie, as you mentioned, the flip side to bad policy is getting the public fired up and paying attention, right? And I think from my perspective, a positive, and I'm going to relate this back to the federal government, right? We're seeing a lot of budget cuts from the federal government. And I think that's been really devastating for certainly organizations doing this work, government workers themselves. But I'm also noticing when we talk to state agencies and working within our state, they're not happy about these funding cuts either. They don't want to see these funding cuts, right? That doesn't help them in the programs that they're running. And so in a lot of ways, there's opportunities where, again, maybe we didn't see eye to eye always with some of the our state officials. There is room and opportunity to actually sort of collaborate and get together and like fight some of this that's happening at the federal level and try to advocate for things like more funding for state revolving fund programs or whatever programs that you all are interested in. And so I think there really is real opportunity here to like actually collaborate with folks who you maybe haven't collaborated with in the past because our state desperately needs funding for some of this work that we're doing. So again, thank you. I really did want to end on a good note and something positive. I didn't want people to walk away from this being like, dang, like we're in a rough place. So please continue fighting the good fight. Thank you again to both Jacksons, to Charles, to Taya, to Kennedy, to our policy interns, to all of you who have come on this call. We really, really appreciate it. And again, reach out if you have any questions or want to talk about anything related to the state session or the work that we do. So thanks again, and I hope you all have a really, really good day. Enjoy the rest of your day.